Pakistan's social media space has been turned into a no-go zone. The authorities there, both the elected ones and the powers lurking behind the scenes, are out to silence political dissent. The investigative news organization that was investigated itself and now has some explaining to do. Plus, what to make of the turmoil in Syria. And given the challenging journalistic terrain there, is the real story getting at it? Pakistan's fragile democracy has been shaken by protests from Karachi to Islamabad, with the imprisoned ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan at the epicenter of a power struggle between the state and its citizens. The government responded by jailing demonstrators and throttling access to the internet. Digital blackouts, periodic crackdowns on press freedom are common in Pakistan. This time around, however, they have been simultaneously sporadic and technologically sophisticated. Journalists are being silenced, platforms like Twitter or X are banned, and VPNs look like they could be criminalized. In a twist that is both ironic and hypocritical, some of those same officials who have banned online platforms saying they have been taken over by terrorists are themselves on some of those platforms tweeting or posting away. And as is almost always the case with politics in Pakistan, the politicians elected by the people aren't necessarily the ones calling the shots. Pakistanis know the signs when they see them. They check their phones and detect a crackdown on the flow of information, such as the one that just coincided with a huge anti-government protest in the capital, Islamabad.
You can't make a phone call. If you send an image, it doesn't download. Audio notes are not going through.
These really bizarre outages of WhatsApp, of social media. You could send a message on WhatsApp, but you could not send a video, and no one could access Instagram or Twitter.
And there is a huge economy on the internet, and that was badly affected. There was no food delivery, people could not call cabs.
And it's very interesting also that when there are no protests going on and nobody's invading Islamabad, the internet flows like water.
There really is no media space quite like Pakistan's. It is a democracy in name only, known as a hybrid regime, where elected politicians like Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif know their place and dare not challenge the real powers working in the background, military and intelligence officials. Where in the election held earlier this year, the PTI party, led by former Prime Minister Imran Khan, appeared headed for victory, despite the fact that Khan was behind bars.
Pakistan Tariq Insaf ka social media ye intikhab jeet gaya.
Until the election returns suddenly stopped coming, apparently mystifying news channels.
20 घंटे होने को हैं और अभी तक हमारे पास मुकम्मल नताइज मौजूद नहीं हैं.
Then the PTI was declared to have lost, a result that fooled almost no one, and which has culminated in vast, violent protests in Islamabad, and the Pakistani authorities cracking down on social media yet again.
Imran Khan is the centerpiece of this protest. It all started when a couple of years ago his government was voted out of power. And he has been saying that he was basically conspired out of power. He is facing a litany of cases, and he's in jail right now, despite the fact that there was an election in between, which his party claims to have been massively rigged. So he wants to come up via street power, and the administration is resisting that. That's the context.
Because mainstream media was not reporting, the social media became the only forum where people could get information during the PTI protests. And so mainstream media completely lost its credibility. Mainstream media was buried by the military. And social media still somehow managed to survive.
The mainstream media, news channels are under strict instructions, what to cover, what not to cover, how to cover it. And because they're commercial organizations, they surrender. The only thing that was out of control of the government, the army, the intelligence agencies is social media. And they have tried over the years by creating strict cyber laws, punishing people, arresting journalists, getting them fired. But what we have seen is a new approach, the so-called firewall.
That firewall, reportedly made in China, is a scaled-down version of the one Beijing deploys domestically. For the Pakistani authorities, who have long used internet blackouts, social media bans, and surveillance to suppress dissent, it is another weapon in their arsenal. One that apparently targets VPNs, the virtual private network software that millions of Pakistanis rely on to circumvent whatever restrictions the establishment throws at them. The establishment being the term that journalists euphemistically use to describe the unelected military powers that be in Pakistan, the ones calling the shots.
The kind of censorship we are seeing is unprecedented. It's not that social media has not been banned before. We've been through over a year of YouTube ban a decade back. We've had X, formerly Twitter, banned and blocked for months now. People are accessing it through VPN, and the government also tried to block access to VPNs, and that made internet access overall really terrible for people.
It is not something even close to resembling what happens in China, the Chinese firewall, but the idea is the same: shutting down certain websites, preventing internet access in areas where militants are using internet to mobilize themselves.
Islami Nazarati Council ne VPN ka istemal ghair shar'i qarar de diya.
Earlier this year, we heard about VPNs being un-Islamic, the religious argument that too many Pakistanis are watching pornography. So using any excuse that you can, pornography, national security, blasphemy, incitement to hatred, fake news, to crack down, to control. So it's a combination of things, including increased surveillance. This entire year, 2024, Pakistan is effectively heading towards a cyber martial law, which is orchestrated by the army, by the intelligence agencies. Ordinary citizens don't know what is being done and how is it being done, but we are all at the receiving end of this censorship.
Sitting in a jail cell, having had an election victory seemingly stolen from him, Imran Khan appears deserving of the sympathy coming his way. But he's no Mandela. There's a track record there from Khan's time in office and since that includes some inconvenient truths. As Prime Minister, Khan cozied up to the military and intelligence establishments until he fell out with them over who should lead Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. And when Khan's party, the PTI, says it is out to restore freedom of the press and protect it, journalists need not go back far to remember when things were different. Even though some of those same journalists now resent having their hands tied when reporting on Khan and his party, restrictions from on high that may actually play into Imran Khan's hands.
This sort of censorship, where you cannot name the leader of a popular party, you cannot show his pictures, is ridiculous.
क्योंकि वकील अब्दुल रज़ाक साहब उन्होंने इमरान खान साहब पर माफी चाहता हूं चेयरमैन तहरीक इंसाफ पर.
But this is how the state of Pakistan functions. Even during Imran Khan's government, he went after certain news media organizations and he crushed them financially. They had to fire people, they had to reduce salaries, and the entire media industry, the business model is such that they need to keep the government on their side for ads and for revenue. And if the government is coming after you, then it becomes very difficult.
During Mr. Khan's administration, Mr. Khan and the military establishment of that time were on the same page. But at the moment, people are being repressed and censored and not allowed to ask for the release of their leader. And those restrictions are not just imposed on the people of one political parties, but Pakistanis at large, even those who are not supporters of Imran Khan. It is the people versus the ruling establishments.
Imran Khan is a political phenomenon. These are undeniable facts, but these are not the only facts. The facts are that since 2014, this city has been invaded by Imran Khan and his parties 7 times.
बाद एक बार फिर पाकिस्तान तहरीक-ए-इंसाफ ने इस्लामाबाद जाने के इरादे का इजहार कर दिया है और ये
No other political party has done that in the country's history. So while Imran Khan is popular and he's a political force to reckon with, his handling of national affairs, including his own party, leaves a lot to be desired.
Among the oddities of Pakistan's latest crackdown on social media are the chinks in the armor. The fact that the blocking of access to VPNs is so sporadic. 1 minute, Pakistanis can connect and get on their platform of choice. The next minute, they cannot. Unless they're Prime Minister Sharif, his Minister of Information, or other members of the cabinet. Their online access is constant. Politicians like to talk about double standards. Pakistans can tweet about them whenever they choose to a population that wishes it could.
People do sometimes joke and tweet at the Prime Minister and ask him if he can share the particular VPN that he's using. Dissenting voices in Pakistan are still continuing to use X despite the ban because they do not want to cede space. They're all still using these platforms and advocating for what they think is right. They don't have that luxury to cede space.
It is a news organization you may have never heard of, but it's influential. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Dozens of major newspapers around the world published the OCCRP's investigations, but this past week, the organization was exposed over its ties to the U.S. government. Tariq Nafi has the details.
Since its founding in the late 2000s, the OCCRP has collaborated with scores of leading news outlets around the world, publishing hard-hitting, sometimes government-toppling scoops. The NGO had a major hand in the Panama Papers and Pandora Papers, which lifted the lid on the financial secrets of the rich and powerful. However, this past week, the OCCRP has been on the receiving end of the very kind of collaborative investigation it specializes in. News outlets in the US, France, Italy, and Greece revealed that the group owes more than half of its funding and its existence to the US government, facts it has never disclosed to its readers. The money comes with strings attached. Because of US funding regulations, Washington can veto senior OCCRP personnel and its, quote, annual work plan, though the NGO says this has never happened in practice and that an editorial firewall protects its journalism from interference. The revelations don't detract from the OCCRP's highly regarded reporting, but they pose legitimate questions about what purpose the organization serves. The OCCRP has aimed only a tiny fraction of its reporting at the US, and the investigation shows US federal agencies have paid it specifically to target countries like Russia and Venezuela, whose governments Washington was trying to destabilize. Once these investigations are published, another US-funded OCCRP program works to initiate criminal investigations or sanctions against the people exposed. In other words, what the OCCRP has been presenting to the world as journalism is also a weapon in the vast arsenal the US deploys against its adversaries. That's something the readers of that journalism deserve to know.
Thanks, Tariq. Last week, with media attention focused elsewhere, rebel forces in Syria stunned the authorities there, capturing the major cities of Aleppo and Hama, as well as other territory under government control, reigniting what was a forgotten conflict. Since 2020, Syria's civil war had been at an impasse after forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, propped up by Russian air power, Iranian troops, and Hezbollah in Lebanon pushed the rebels back into the northwestern province of Idlib. But with Assad's allies bogged down in Ukraine or facing off against Israel, rebel groups seized the moment. And while many in Aleppo have welcomed the rebels as liberators, others fear the group now in charge, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, could be even worse. HTS is a hardline Islamist group that has its origins in ISIL and al-Qaeda. It has since rebranded preaching a more moderate message. To understand the significance of this moment and the competing narratives around it, we are speaking with a journalist and historian from Aleppo, Karam Nachar. He is the founder and executive director of the alternative news website Al-Jumhuriya, and he joins us now from Istanbul, Turkey. Thanks for speaking with us today, Karam. Help us understand how we got here, why this is happening now, and why, after so many years of an apparent stalemate, the Assad regime appears to be in jeopardy.
There's an element of surprise for sure in terms of the extent and the pace of the military victories achieved by the rebels over the past week. But there's definitely a context. In the past month or two, there's been incessant bombardment by the Russian Air Force and the Syrian military on the northwest of the country, the areas that are under the rebel control. There's also obviously the context that was sort of created after October 7th. Iran has been severely weakened in Syria. Obviously, we shouldn't forget that there are Iranian militias all over the Syrian territory. But on top of all of these sort of like more immediate reasons for why this is happening, we shouldn't forget that there's a longer story behind this. The 2011 moment, the Syrian uprising, the fact that despite the uprising becoming a proxy war and a civil war with jihadist elements, you can't avoid the fact that there are large segments of the Syrian population that don't want to live under Bashar al-Assad anymore. The last thing that I want to say also is that since 2018, Assad has sort of promised his own constituency that the situation was going to get better. It didn't. Economically, Syria now is arguably worse than it was during the heaviest days of the Syrian war earlier. And so that also left even key segments of its own military, of the state bureaucracy, completely underfunded and prone to corruption, lack of morale. And so I think that also is partly at play in terms of how Aleppo was just fell very quickly, and there doesn't seem to have been a real fight there. They just pulled out in a hurry.
Let's talk about the rebel group that it's at the core of this offensive, known as HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Hardline Islamist group led by former al-Qaeda fighter Abu Muhammad al-Jillani. Talk to us a little bit about the origins of the group, how it is governed in the areas that have been previously under its control, such as in the province of Idlib, especially when it comes to things like human rights, press freedom.
Yeah, so at the moment there are more than 10 different factions fighting together. But yes, there's no doubt that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is the single most complex and sophisticated organization, both militarily as well as politically. And it also happens to be an Islamist organization. Now, they've sort of split from Al-Qaeda, and then they themselves sort of engaged in a constant attempt, especially after they were dealt a very heavy blow after 2016, after they were sort of like left with that little corner in the northwest of the country, to sort of rebrand themselves and to open up. Whether this is cosmetic, window dressing, or real is unclear. Let's just put it this way. They've changed their name. They've included different factions. And so it's a hodgepodge of different groups. And I would say that they've sort of shifted slowly. Education in the Northwest definitely has Islamist curricula, has an Islamist sort of substance. Equally, it was very dire for non-Muslim minorities or for non-Sunni minorities in the earliest days. So there's a small Druze community in Idlib. There's a very old Christian community of Idlib. But Jillani, as he himself sort of attempted to refashion himself over the past 2 years, has sort of made attempts as well to allow for certain dialogue or for certain more moderate sort of engagement with these elements.
There must be a legal framework that protects and ensures the rights of all.
There is journalism. There are civil society organizations. It's not the Taliban. We know that the regions under Jillani's control over the past year have witnessed demonstrations against him because of his own heavy-handed governance, the fact that the people around him are by and large his own family members and his own close friends. And interestingly enough, the people demonstrating are both elements of civil society organizations, journalists that we've worked with, as well as members of Islamic groups that are hard, like even more right-wing in terms of their Islamic ideology. So there's definitely an Islamist ideology now, but there's been some changes there from a hardline ideologue to a more pragmatic, but yet still authoritarian figure.
Let's focus on Damascus for a moment. The government of Bashar al-Assad, the fall of Aleppo seemed to catch the authorities off guard. What has been the response so far from Damascus, from the news outlets under the government's control?
To be honest, there's been very little change, because from the very early days of the Syrian uprising, back then in 2011 when it was a peaceful uprising, the line has always been that these are terrorists that are funded by the United States and Israel.
فالمؤامرات كالجراثيم تتكاثر في كل لحظة وفي كل مكان.
In terms of the Syrian state media and what the media in regime-controlled areas is saying, this is just terrorism, or when it comes to the details of the war, they're not winning.
شاهدنا هجمة إرهابية غير مسبوقة مدعومة من الأمريكي، مدعومة من الإسرائيلي، مدعومة من التركي، بالإضافة حتى الأوكراني.
And then there's the other side, where like there's an overzealous attempt on the part of the rebel factions to show themselves as, you know, has been completely reshaped, has been sort of reincarnated. And so a lot of the smaller opposition media groups, they've been interviewing a lot of, you know, residents of the city of Aleppo, Christian women, talking about, oh, that we're going to celebrate Christmas soon and everything is okay.
والحمد لله عم نجهز حالنا وعم نجهز امورنا والسواق مفتوحه وعم ننزل نتسوق والشباب كويسه.
Even that you also have to take with a pinch of salt, because they could be scared because they feel that the person that they're talking to is a journalist, but at the same time he's a journalist who's being able to move freely, so maybe he's a journalist who's, you know, supported by the de facto powers in the city. So it's hard to verify everything. There's a lot of disinformation going around on social media, so I don't think social media is sort of the answer to the fact that the traditional media is sort of controlled by the two different sides. So what we try to do is to just bear witness and to be very vigilant to all the human rights violations being committed on all parties.
With the Russians now bombing some rebel targets, the Syrian army ramping up its counteroffensive, the groups that launched this operation are in for a fight. Do they have any real prospect of long-term victory, of keeping the territory that they now control? And is there any end in sight for this conflict for the people of Syria?
Well, this is the million-dollar question. And so all the eyes will be on the Astana talks, which won't take place in Astana as they used to, but rather in Qatar. They're supposed to take place in Doha. This will be the first time that the Turkish foreign minister and the Iranian and Russian foreign ministers will sit together. There needs to be a negotiation, but there needs to be a real solution where the vast majority of Syrian refugees who are terrified to go back for fear of reprisals, they would feel secure that they can go back, and there's a new system one way or the other. A real change in the political system in the country that would allow for real early recovery and post-war reconstruction to start. But none of that is clear yet, and the worst possible scenario would be for these rebel factions to have undertaken this massive operation without any real and clear endgame in sight, and without any sort of coordination with the regional powers and even the two superpowers or the two main brokers, you know, of this conflict, Russia and to a lesser extent the United States of America.
That's where we'll leave it. Karam Nachar, thank you so much for speaking to us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, this past week, the disruptive British political campaign group known as Led by Donkeys unveiled its latest art installation protesting Israel's war on Gaza. Just across the road from the Houses of Parliament in London, a huge banner was laid out, big enough to be seen from the sky, saying, yes, it's a genocide. Led by Donkeys backed up their sign with a statement from an Israeli historian, Amos Goldberg, on Israeli war crimes in Gaza.
It does not need to look like the Holocaust to be a genocide. Each genocide looks different, but there does need to be a clear intent, and indeed, there are clear indications of intent to destroy Gaza.
Human rights organizations have said the same, and you can now add Amnesty International to that list. It published the results of an investigation this past week that concluded Israel has committed and continues to commit genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. This is not the first time Amnesty has sounded the alarm. Almost 3 years ago, early in 2022, it was one of the first rights groups to label Israel an apartheid state. Back then, Amnesty's warnings were largely dismissed. Will things be any different now that it's calling Israel a genocidal state?